Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm Elle Kamihira. Before we begin, I want to give a bit of a heads up. The day we did this interview happened to be very, very windy, where my guest Aurora Linnea was recording from. And you can definitely hear the wind in the background. So apologies for that. I do think it's kind of fitting that Mother Nature decided to participate in this interview this way, and you'll hear why in the interview shortly. At any rate, so we may look around and see what Aurora calls the world-destroying violence of male dominion, the destruction of the natural environment, violent misogyny against women the world over, endless wars, brutal oppression and exploitation of people, of animals, of nature itself, and wonder, how did we get here? Why are we living like this? And the fact is that our current culture is based on a set of ideas that male philosophers have crafted over the last 3,000 years or so about all of what life is and their central and superior place in it. And those ideas are manifested in our everyday reality in all sorts of destructive ways. And those ideas also started somewhere. And my guest on this episode, author Aurora Linnea, just came out with a phenomenally beautiful book called Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life. And that title sounds a lot darker than it is. It's actually a very poetic and optimistic book. And in it, she digs deep down into our cultural history to find the roots, the origins, the first impulses that set man on this path to apocalyptic world domination. And so in this hour, we talk about man's fear of death and life, the fear-to-domination pipeline, women as the eternal scapegoat, man's revenge against biology, the need for radical empathy, and how necessary it is that we end male dominion. Congratulations on your book. It's been a little bit now, I guess. It's been launched for a little bit.
Yeah, so it was published. It came out on November 5th, which was the election here in the U.S.
Oh, crazy. I can hear the wind, yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
My God. It's crazy. Where in the world are you, by the way?
I live in Maine.
Oh, you live in Maine. Okay.
Yeah. And you're in New York, right?
I'm in New York. This is the first interview in quite some time that's been like in the same time zone. But at any rate, so your book, Man Against Being, Body Horror and the Death of Life, came out in November. I'd love to hear a little bit about your impetus for writing the book.
This project had been something I had been working on sort of in the background over the last couple of years. I have been long really interested in just all of the different ways that I was seeing in the culture in which I lived, and like hatred of our bodies and biological bodies and ourselves as animals seemed really central to so many oppressive systems, and just seemed such a recurring theme in so many different cultural arenas that I had been sort of playing with this issue for a long time. So I had been writing for Women's Liberation Radio News, and in doing that, I was in contact with Renata Klein of Spin Effects, and she became a real supporter of my writing for WLRN, and then she reached out to me and asked if I had thought of doing a full-length manuscript. And I had several chapters of this in a different form ready to go, and I took that chance. Yeah.
First of all, it's beautifully written and it is very poetic. I think it is an indictment of patriarchy for sure, but it's also extremely hopeful to me. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit first off about, so I always like when we are talking about ecology, the destruction of the environment, humanity's history of how we got here, etc. We always talk about humanity. We always talk about it as one, us humans. And I think you put this disaster that we find ourselves in kind of at the feet of man, man with a capital M, sort of the patriarchal man. I'd love to know like how you got there.
Sure. So for feminists, this use of man as the generic has always been really problematized. Like, we really dislike this, right? Because it's criticized for leaving women out of world making and cultural development. And so I had criticized that as well, and obviously always noticed when male writers and even women writers would use man as the generic, because man obviously leaves women out of humanity. And so we're used to thinking of it in that way. But then I also, at the same time, in my own sort of adolescent misanthropy when I was quite a bit younger, I thought of
I love that. Adolescent misanthropy. Yeah, I got a lot of that myself.
I'm still
Anyway.
getting over it, it's a process.
Yeah.
But I was very environmentally concerned, and I would say things like humanity is a blight and the human species is a scourge on the planet. And then putting these two things together, like the way that the culture broadly was so willing to call, like for man to take credit of culture making when it's viewed sort of positively, but when we're talking about devastation, it suddenly becomes humanity. I thought that seemed really suspect. And that set me off on this train of thinking, like, no, it really is man. And like, when they've left us out by saying man has done this and man has done this, it's true. Women have not been the engineers and the authors of this society. This society, this civilization is man-made effectively. Women obviously have participated and collaborated in all kinds of ways. I don't mean to leave that out or exclude that reality ever, but men have been in power. And so it is man-made. And therefore, any of these problems that we look at, the devastation of the world, like capitalism even, these are outgrowths of male power, and they need to be understood as such. And male power and male domination needs to be what's indicted when we're looking at any of these things.
It's so interesting, and I think very few are confident enough to divide things along our sexes. So I really, really appreciate it because, and I don't want to be glib, but it feels like we live on different planets, men and women, but we don't. We live on the same planet.
Yes.
And I don't think we're going to solve this issue unless we look at men and women in different motivations, different drivers, different roles we've had in our history. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to move on to, and I find this so incredibly interesting too. You're having such a storm.
It's just really gusty. This winter has been so windy. It hasn't been bad for snow or anything else, just constant wind. I sort of tested different rooms in my house for windiness, and they're all equally windy. So I apologize on behalf of the environment.
Yeah. It's kind of fitting too. I kind of love the disruption. So I wanted to get on to, you kind of ground the beginning of talking about like man's domination in his fear, like you identified man's fear. And I think we don't talk about that enough. And so if you can talk about like what you mean by man's fear or like terror of, well, I'll let you talk.
I really do feel that man's terror of being a mortal material creature on Earth is kind of the crux of this really pathological way of being that has developed and that we see all around us in civilization as we know it. I started seeing this actually, interestingly enough. I've always been a real sort of horror movie enthusiast.
Oh, are you?
But I've always seen them as this really, really interesting glimpse into fear, obviously, and what it is that the collective conscious orbits around. In horror movies, they come back again and again to, no matter whether it's sort of like a monster movie or a zombie movie or any of this, it's always this sort of deep horror of the body's vulnerability to the external world. And so that got me thinking about this. And then once I had identified that, I started seeing it everywhere. This fixation, too, with controlling reality, controlling life, and domination, and also like trying to escape reality in various ways. That has to be coming from somewhere. We tend to talk about power and domination almost as if they exist without cause. It's like they're for their own sake. That never satisfied me. And so, in trying to figure out what this impulse towards power and control and domination was, I landed on fear and antagonism, like the antagonism and hostility towards the world in which we live that emerges from that fear of the body and of the natural world.
And also of death.
Yeah.
You write about, because part of this is driven towards agelessness or combating the natural life-death cycle.
Yeah. Immortality is huge in man-made cultures. All of the sort of dominant religious systems have as their ultimate promise an escape out of death, immortality. And so you have that in the religious sphere. And then in the secular scientific sphere, which is supposed to be motivated by objective inquiry and sort of cool-headed rationalism. But if you look at it, it has the same sort of fear-based motivations. Tons and tons of money goes into these types of like immortalist science. It's hugely popular right now. All of the sort of male elite are pouring money into it, and they either want to live forever, or they want to live elsewhere off of the earth, or they want to live in virtual spaces that are not contaminated by death.
You talk about Cartesian dualism, and this is another thing we don't talk about enough either, is that the philosophers who were all male divided the world into dualism, into two warring opposites. So like mind from body, most importantly, I think, science from nature, male from female. And this has done, I think, more damage to our world than we can ever give it credit for. And I'm just going to do a quote here, and then you can take it from there. So you write that man takes as his own and calls masculine all talents he claims derived from the mind, the male mind: intelligence, rationality, logic, willpower, objectivity. Masculine wisdom is absolute and changeless and best attained through mathematics, the manliest of disciplines. Love that.
I agree absolutely that this division of mind from body and the dualistic chain that follows from that, wherein everything is categorized on one side or the other and then labeled effectively like low or high and bad and good, because it's hierarchical too. It's not just divided, it becomes a hierarchy, and it is the really fundamental justification for oppressions of all kinds. And so I think I agree completely that that dualism cannot be indicted enough, because it really is like the seed, the seed ideology for all of these things that we're looking at.
For patriarchy, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It is the core patriarchal structure, is this dualistic division. And you see it reemerge constantly. It's so foundational that it's not even really noticed. It becomes invisible because it's so built in. And so even feminists will replicate it sometimes. And so we really have to be attentive to it, I think. Also, to just go back to this immortality issue again, dualism really functions to maintain immortality because it separates this immaterial mind from the material body, and the immaterial mind is able to go on living forever while the material body dies. And even Descartes, the philosopher for whom Cartesian dualism is named, he is quite explicit in his writings on this dualism that his point was to preserve the soul against death. Dualism is linked to Descartes, but he's not really the creator of it by any stretch. It goes back, there's like Plato. He calls the body things like a prison or a tomb in which the soul is imprisoned, and the soul there is analogous with the mind. So we have like 3,000 years of this dualistic structure that we have never really taken seriously as a ideological prohibition against peace in the world, right?
Yeah.
Against a healthy relation to ourselves and others and the earth.
Yeah. And so in this like dualistic way of thinking, women have been equated with nature and man with science, and man science good, woman nature bad. Unless it can be used for good purposes.
Right. If the woman nature is a useful resource, then she's good to be exploited, certainly, by the male mind scientist masterclass. Yeah, there are really explicit iterations of this analogy in the kind of like rhetoric of Enlightenment science. The father of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, who was kind of a contemporary of Descartes, in his celebrations of science and the scientific method, he described it as putting nature on the rack and extracting her secrets. He always spoke of nature in the feminine, and he wrote of putting her in the scientist's service and making her the scientist's slave. So this has always been this has been quite explicit.
Yeah. And the truth is that, I'm going to quote you again here, gestation, partition, nursing, these are the animal activities around which female existence is organized. And we can get into bioessentialism a little bit later, but the truth of female bodies is that we create life, and so we can't separate ourselves from the natural processes, whether we want to or not.
Right. And if men fear those natural processes and fear being alive, there's obviously also then going to be a lot of resentment for women for having brought them into the world. And so there's a lot of antagonism that begins there. There's a lot of hostility for women that comes just out of women's having bore men as vulnerable beings' bodies into the world. And that also sets women up as a site for control. Like, man has to gain control over women to gain control over this creation process that so imperils him.
Him, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You talk about, and I want to return to this, the terror of death and life and the origins of life, how that turns to domination. And I'm going to quote you, terror turns to an addiction to dominion, turns to world-destroying violence in the service of a delusion. That's a lot, but I'd like to. It is so precise and great in terms of like, yeah, that's the pipeline.
Yeah, I loved that you called it the like fear of death to domination pipeline, because that's exactly what it is. And yeah, I think it works in a couple of different ways, really. I think that so if you're man and you are this body, this organism, sort of inescapably, like you're finding no way actually to escape what you are before you die, and you see all around you, right, that men, for your peers, for all of their clambering and scrambling and struggling, they're still dying. There is this real drive to get control over as much as you can. First, to sort of like grasp at some degree of domination that would allow you to forestall your own death. Like if you can just dominate enough, you'll stop. You'll stop the murderous nature from being able to get you. You'll pull yourself free of that maw. And then also, there's sort of this overcompensation, right? Like if you can't prevent your own death and you can't control for that and you can't control your own body, well, you can dominate everything else. You can dominate everyone else, and then you will at least be as close to this all-powerful, ostensibly immortal God that you aspire towards being. And then there's also, I think, an element of revenge in it, really, which is that destruction and violence itself becomes domination as a means to get back at the biological, material, mortal reality that you see as attacking you. Men are avenging themselves on nature and everyone who they've sort of projected nature onto.
Right. Women, most obviously.
Women, yeah.
Yeah. I also find this interesting that you talk about killing or murdering as a way to like pacify or seed and calm an existential anxiety.
Yeah. I write about it as this like you drive death away from yourself by killing others, and you get to feel yourself the victor over death by having like your boot on the neck of your victim. And I write about this in the book as well, or I mention it. There is a sort of mid-century psychoanalyst named Gregory Zilborg who wrote this article, just this very sort of like pithy article in some psychoanalytic journal just called Fear of Death. That's the article. And he wrote it during World War II. He says to overcome the fear of death, we do so by means of murder. So killing others is the way to get out of your fear of death. And he was indeed sort of activating this premise to bolster support for the war effort.
The war.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah. There's so much that makes sense when you think of it this way. Forever trying to figure out what are the sort of primary driver towards war. I cannot stop at like thinking, oh, it's just a contest over territory. I just don't think that's it. It's more. That
doesn't satisfy it. Like it has to be deeper than that. Yeah. I feel like people stop there, but like, why would you what's the purpose of territory? Like, what are the motivations for these things? What is the value of the thing in itself? It's never just what it is.
Exactly. Yeah. And seeing how our world is like essentially like organized around male violence, you have to start thinking about what are the actual psychological drivers or emotional, psychological, I don't know what to call it.
Yeah.
Biopsycho.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump to, this concept that you write a lot about using, man using other bodies, and not just for killing, but like you kind of connect industrial animal husbandry and using women for whether it's prostitution or marriage or breeding or any of the things that women have been used for. If you can talk about this idea of using other bodies for purposes.
Yeah. In trying to link this psychopathology of terror and rejection of the body and of material reality to systems of oppression, the underlying process that seemed apparent to me and seems apparent to me is this process of scapegoating, really. And we talk about scapegoating a lot in sort of pop cultural parlance, where it mostly means like to wrongfully blame someone for something that a higher up may have done. But that's not really what scapegoating is. If you look at it as a cultural phenomenon that's very sort of cross-cultural and quite historical. Obviously, the term scapegoating comes from the ritual that's described in Leviticus, practiced in Israel, where there were goats. There are these goats, and one of the goats has the sins of the people placed upon its head, and then it becomes the embodiment. It's not like the goat is being blamed for these things that these people did. The goat becomes the embodiment. It becomes sin incarnate, and then it is driven out. And so that sort of thing, wherein someone of a sacrificial victim is made to actually incarnate that which is viewed as sinful or evil or bad, or that which is feared, and is then exiled or punished or killed in some way. That is a really common cultural practice historically and across the world. And I think that is what is happening in the oppression of women and in the way that we relate to non-human animals. And it really plays into racial oppression as well, and the ways that religious and ethnic groups are degraded in various different societies. And what's happening, I theorize, is that it is the sin and the evil of the body that is being projected onto these others, non-human animals, women, the racialized, so that man can be free of the body. He's purging his own vulnerable, mortal, material body, putting it onto the scapegoat that he has decided upon, and then driving it out in whatever way, punishing, dominating, destroying the body in the body of the other in order to imagine himself having mastered that which he can't ultimately. It's an imaginary process. It always is.
Yeah, but he acts it out cyclically in all these different ways. Another thing you can't unsee once you see it this way, I feel like. Yeah. You move on to the darker side of this process when you talk about sadism and torture. And I've been looking at prostitution and pornography for some years. And that is the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking about the seeds of torture, the drivers of why torture exists, that it feels this is the impulse. The impulse you're talking about is kind of the seeds to why prostitution exists. But you talk about the excremental universe, and I'd love, so that was a lot too. I just threw a lot at you, but if you can take whatever you like. And
Sure. I definitely agree that in these cultural phenomena, that prostitution and pornography, they are cultural phenomena. They're these practices in which man makes the woman, the body, in order to use her for the bolstering of his own sense of not being the body. So he is humiliating and torturing and degrading the woman as the body in these instances, making her a commodity in prostitution. So much of pornography is just complete hostility and humiliation of the female body. And that's the kick, right? If you look at these things, you can see that it's not about sex. It's like so clearly about the need to inflict violence and to dominate and to degrade. And it's not some sort of arbitrary, causeless brutality. It's doing something for man's sense of his own self. He's setting her down as the bottom so that he can stand as on top as he can make himself. But to speak to the excremental universe, this is a term that I first encountered in the work of the feminist animal activist Karen Davis, and her focus was really on the sort of treatment of chickens, specifically in industrial agriculture. But what she was writing about was the way that this reality is constructed for the creature, in this case, the chickens, but it could be the target of whatever, the target of this hostility or this degradation. I speak about it for women in pornography, and I compare it also to the treatment of prisoners in concentration camps during the Holocaust. The basic mechanism is that this reality is constructed that is so wholly defined by baseness and filth. It's made as disgusting as possible and crafted to like fully materialize the sort of squalor that men associate with being a body, so that men can see the animal or the woman or the Jewish prisoner in this space and then say, ah, yes, like you are as disgusting as I say you are, as I imagine you to be. And then I'm like justified in holding you in this contempt. And I can then treat you with whatever violence I care to. But it's really about seeing the other as the filth and the squalor of the body. And at the same time, the man is distancing himself from that by putting himself in these more sort of clean and sterile spaces. It's really obvious in the case of the concentration camps within German society, where German society really prided itself on these kinds of like marvels of sanitation and things in particular. And then you have these concentration camps where they have people living in human waste effectively, and dead bodies. And that was not unintentional. That was part of the degradation of these people.
Yeah, they could have done it completely differently. They could have kept them prisoners, but they did so much more than that. And I think that betrays the real driver behind it all. I love your use of the word corporeality. Am I saying that right? Corporeality?
I've heard it said different ways. Yeah. Okay. So corporeality is how I say it. Corporeality. Yeah.
Okay. It essentially means the reality of the body, right?
Right.
Yeah. And you use it a lot, and it's so effective because it takes you back to the body as reality. And you say here, through the act of torture, then man experiences the ultimate remove from his own corporeality. And the body's pain is the lifeblood of male power. For all power, man says, is based on conquering the body and then leaving it behind. So that kind of like spoke to what you just said. And also what you talk about torture, and I'll get off this very dark subject in a minute. I know you wrote it though.
Yeah. No need to spare me.
Yeah. But you wrote about torture, and other people have written this about torture too, which I think is so, so, so important. And it also reminds me of what abusive relationships look like really, long-term abusive relationships look like. That the torturer calls it a dissolution. He massacres the detainee's capacity for creating coherence and meaning. He empties her of relationships, convictions, habits, symbols, language. Everything that makes us human is blotted out.
Yeah, I will say that I think abusive relationships fit. I think they fit the definition of torture. I think they are torturous. I think men torture women in these relationships. And it's not acknowledged as that, but it certainly is that. And I think what's important in this dynamic, because of the dualism, for man to have a self, women can't have selves, because if self is linked to the mind and the immaterial, and in order for the man to be those things, he needs the woman to be the body and mortal and nature. She can't also have the self. So his self-making, masculine self-making, is this constant process of the decimation of the selfhood of women and of everything else. He's the only self that is allowed to exist, because any other self threatens his capacity to believe in his mastermind status over reality.
So obviously, women are not immune. We don't live in our own vacuum reality. We have completely adopted, if not completely, of course, we have people who are critical and who are thinking critically about all of this, but every woman around the world exists in this universe that has been created for us, and we take on board a lot of this stuff. You talk a lot about this internalized hatred, internalized self-hatred, I should say.
Yeah, women's internalized hatred of femaleness, which therefore is self-hatred, is of course a tremendous problem, and it has many, many, many different manifestations, and different ways of showing up culturally. My focus in the book, when I speak about this, I'm mostly speaking about women's rejection of bodiliness itself, because femaleness and bodiliness are equated. And so in women's trying to escape oppression or escape really negative self-concepts, we'll say, there has been, and there still is, we see it in all sorts of different ways, an attempt to separate one's womanhood from bodiliness, to try and reject that as well. And it's clearly a reaction to the dualism, to the dualistic analogy of woman as body. And there's this great quote where Simone de Beauvoir, who was, I love The Second Sex, it's a wonderful book, but she was very resentful in this way of being cast as a female body. And she was always scrabbling for an identification with the male mind. She was still operating in these terms. And she talks about her female fleshiness, this taking on of flesh, as a painful fall from grace. And that conception of being a female body and being bodily as a fall from grace is an unfortunate constant in a lot of women's attempts to work against oppression. And sort of the most explicit, more extreme side of that we see now is all of these young women who are so eager to disidentify with the female body that they're proactively harming their female bodies in order to identify with a more disembodied masculinity. And that's not, that aspect is not really interrogated, I think, very much. But then there's also, in feminist rhetoric, you'll see a lot this kind of talk of women being more than our bodies, like, and not just a body. And of course, one is never just a body because mind and body are one thing, right? If you're not speaking in dualistic terms, this is kind of a nonsensical
Exactly.
claim. Then there's the kind of postmodern take that has women rejecting bodiliness and sort of minimizing the female body and casting it as more like a construct or a text or sort of just like a notion. So there's a lot of this in feminism, but in all of these cases, what we're doing is we're accepting men's terms. We're accepting dualism still as our like guiding structure, and we're just reacting instead of recognizing that like we're all bodies, men as well as women. There's nothing singularly female about being a body, nor is there anything inherently oppressive about it. And so all of this rejection of bodiliness ultimately only reinforces this patriarchal dualistic conceptualization of reality and really harms us, as all self-hatred does, you know.
Nowhere is this clearer to me than the enormous amount of plastic surgery and normalization of plastic surgery that's kind of enveloped our culture.
Yeah, it's it's pretty grotesque. I agree.
And also, as a sidebar, most plastic surgeons and most people making money in plastic surgery are males.
Of course, yeah. Women are the primary clientele and men are the doctors sculpting the female image according to their specifications, because the specifications, the like image that women seek to realize through plastic surgery is always one crafted in the context of this male dominated culture. And then you have these men who are the emissaries of that culture who make women into that and profit off of it. So it's a perfect patriarchal scam, really.
Yeah, no kidding. So women go to these offices and kind of like have these doctors tell them what's imperfect about them or how they're defective somehow. And then, this is how we can make you perfect. And what I decide is perfect. And of course, and you mentioned earlier about women who, kind of the most extreme form of plastic surgery or body modification as a form of self-hatred, this enormous trend of young girls or women who are amputating their breasts and changing their bodies. You do talk about transgenderism as a movement in your book and frame it a certain way, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think transgenderism is sometimes seen as kind of like a new development and kind of ahistorical, something that certainly those who support transgenderism and body modification in this way will celebrate it as radical and anti-patriarchal. But in fact, once again, it's based in this fundamental patriarchal structure of mind against body. In the transgenderist rhetoric, it would be like your true self. And then you have the body that is an impediment to the full becoming or the full satisfaction, gratification of that true self. The body is this extraneous substance wrapped around the self or the soul or the mind. Again, it is a flawed garment that the mind has every right to and should alter to become itself purely. And what that means is that you are not your body. Once again, you've divided it and you've got the soul, the self, the mind as some sort of weird resident in an unknown alcove of this fleshy vessel that needs to be altered according to the dictates of the mind. So transgenderism in that way is really just it's as kind of retrograde patriarchal as you can get. And then clearly the fact that so much of the buy-in is from young women who have been conditioned to despise their bodies and are benefiting a male-dominated medical industrial complex in the seeking to be rid of their bodies, it makes it all the more clear. But again, like when you're starting with your premise as the dualistic division of mind from body, you're never going to go anywhere but into more and different elaborations of patriarchy. At most, you'll have novel forms of patriarchy. You're never going to get to resistance of patriarchy. You're never going to get to any other place when you start from that ground.
Yeah, you talk about Martin Rothblatt, who's one of the bigger sort of figures in the transgender movement and transhumanism, who espoused this sort of, he says, I believe we're on the threshold of creating humanity and personhood outside of DNA-driven flesh bodies. For men like Martin Rothblatt, maddened by how material reality squelches his sovereignty, he's affronted by any breach of his control. To be born into anybody is all wrong.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, to have a body that is not self-designed is an infringement of the absolute control that these men want. In that way, you can really see this as just kind of a like unhinged extreme of this incapacity to reconcile themselves with a body and a material reality that is ultimately outside of any of our control. There's no capacity to reconcile with that within patriarchy. And so these men rail against it in all of these ways. And Martin Rothblatt makes that altogether clear. He's a perfect paragon of the psychopathology at play.
It's all very aligned with this idea that we're the human body as a machine. That's also an old story, that we're machines, a mechanistic mentality. And you write here, the mechanistic mentality makes it conceivable to compare bodies to hardware and operating systems, brains to software, and death to a system crash. But only the body already conceptualized as a machine can be substituted for one. And I thought that was really, really, really interesting.
I think that comes up when I'm talking about the man-made machine wombs and sex bots and things, right? And it's really alarming how in our culture, the emergence of something like a machine womb or a machine sex slave feels like a natural progression, right? It's like, yes, men are just like, yes, of course. Yes, of course. This will be a much more efficient and like convenient entity for me to use in the ways that I wish to. The fact that the mind moves so readily from the being to the machine replacement speaks to the fact that already that being is conceived of as a machine, and there's no respect there for the beinghood of that creature, that woman, that animal that is already been made into the body in this system. That mechanization is part of the dissolution of the selfhood or the like bodily integrity. The integrity of an organism. There's this wonderful author, Carolyn Merchant, who wrote this book, The Death of Nature, and she is speaking about the emergence of the mechanistic mindset within Enlightenment science and how what it did and what its purpose was to really just like clear the natural world, of any kind of like vitalism, any kind of internal reality or livingness deserving of respect, in order that it could be exploited and used in whatever ways men wanted to.
The post-biological future they envision.
Yeah. I mean, the post-biological future for man, he wants that because he wants to have done with his own body, but he also wants all of his, in his like ultimate fantasy, he also wants everything in his purview replaced with machinery because it's more perfectly controllable. So he wants to consummate himself as machine because machine is invulnerable, is immortal, is external to the natural world, but that's not what he wants for women, say. He wants women to be replaced by machines because they make more perfectly controllable slaves.
So now that we've talked about the darkness, I want to go to you lay out this very elegant path to a way out, I should say, a reframing of all of this. And one of the first things you talk about is that as women, we must embrace our bodies and act against this notion that we are not our bodies. You say, we are not the fever dream hallucination of monstrous femaleness that haunts man's anxious, addled mind. I love that. And it's true.
Yeah, well, in that too, I was responding to this tendency within feminism to incorporate the rejection of bodiliness. And it makes a lot of sense when someone says and has oppressed you on the basis of your being a body, and it's consistently reiterated that, like, you are a body, bodies are low. That's the reason why it is right that I have power over you, that I dominate and destroy you in these ways. It's quite natural that the reaction to that would be to say, no, I'm not what you say I am, and therefore your your oppression is unjust. But it's a tacit acceptance of the legitimacy of contempt for and hostility towards bodies, but that is what we all are. So we can't start off on that, right? You're still operating from a basic place of self-rejection and of rejection of reality. For that reason, I do really think it's important and necessary for women to come to terms with the fact that we are bodies, and to incorporate that into our feminism, to make that a grounds of feminism, is the defense of ourselves as bodies and a defense of bodies, like bodies as creatures, and this being enough, right? Like, it is enough that a being is alive and an embodied entity. That alone makes it worthy of defense and like embrace. Like, this is what life is. We have to accept and love it. So much of the way that patriarchal oppression operates is really to turn women against their bodies on an individual basis. Obviously, there's so much violence against us, and that is always inflicted on our bodies. And there's so much misogyny that's just permeating the culture that makes the female body into an object of disgust. And so we become really alienated from our bodies, either through trauma or through acceptance
Television.
of these images. Yeah. Television
the endless,
traumatizing.
the endless dead woman show.
Right. Yeah. What kind of defense of ourselves and our sisters as women can we launch if we're completely alienated from our bodies? Because if resistance doesn't have a material basis, and if it doesn't have this kind of vital strength at its core that comes from being a living body on earth, how can we really move? How can we bring life to our resistance if we are resisting the lives that we are and that we have?
Rejecting and alienating ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
You also talk about, the interconnectedness of life, which is what man is at war against, is this idea that he's in fact not a master of creation, that he's not the mastermind of the universe, and that everything, like you said, has its own innate intelligence and its own innate life. And you say the war of all against all is man's model. That is not the living world.
I think there's this in nature documentaries, for example, the drama of nature documentaries as they're set up is usually like this great battle between like your mountain lion and your elk or something, right? It's always set up in this way where you're made to see the natural world in terms of competition and hostility and violence. That is the image that we're presented. But in fact, the living world is not just a parking lot covered in blood, because the actual reality of nature is symbiosis and mutualism. Like organisms and populations and ecosystems are all working together to sustain life on Earth. And it's not a battle. That image is imposed onto it. It's really about communion and collaboration and symbiosis and connection. That is what keeps everything going and growing. And we've really been misled by these narratives that present reality as both as man fears it and as he needs it to be to sustain his own delusional sense of self.
You talk about empathy and this like sensitivity to all that is. And obviously our empathy has been very dulled through patriarchy and through patriarchal violence and all of these philosophies that we've talked about.
I think empathy under patriarchy, empathy is really inhibited by this rejection of bodily vulnerability and softness. So if you're unwilling to accept your vulnerabilities as a creature, and vulnerability to wounding is vulnerability to pain, then this tends towards a rejection of sensitivity, which is a rejection of the pain of others as well as your own, right? And men, in rejecting their own vulnerability, they then have contempt for others that they see as vulnerable. So the wounded in this model, the wounded or the weak, right? And we're all, if vulnerability is weakness, then we're all weak in that way. But then, so the vulnerable other becomes an object of contempt rather than of compassion, and is more likely to be targeted for attack or assault than care. That model makes empathy kind of unthinkable. And then empathy, too, within that model is scorned as feminine, gets coded as feminine, basically. And so the outcome is this real culture of carelessness and desensitization, because one also can't show that one has empathy or compassion for others, because that impugns one's own invulnerability. So you don't want to be seen as being sensitive either. So the process is to desensitize in order to maintain your own armor against it. And so that is what makes it really possible for us to live in this world that is suffused with atrocity. And like there's just so much suffering and harm and exploitation all around us, and yet we've been desensitized to it. And that desensitization is like mandated in order to live. But by living in it, we become participants and collaborators in it as well. There's this great quote by he's like this real sort of 60s counterculture radical theater activist who's questionable in a lot of respects, but I do love him for this. And he said, his name is Julian Beck, and he says, if we could really feel, the pain would be so great that we would stop all suffering. If we opened ourselves up to sensitivity, to empathy, to attention to the suffering of others and of ourselves, we would not allow civilization to continue to wreak such harms. We would not allow it to be this way. And so I think that reopening of empathy, which is natural to us because these systems are in place to shut it off. Empathy is intrinsic to us. You see it with there's like recent research that has like rats and mice helping out their suffering comrades, like this is what we do as animals. We take care of one another.
Yeah.
Unlocking that empathy is for me really the necessary beginning of being able to respond to the world as it is, that is so painful.
You do talk about that ordinarily, like women would take it upon ourselves to be the empathetic ones, that it can't be that.
No. Yeah, I mean, women have been sabotaged as like the compassion class, right? We're supposed to completely sacrifice ourselves in this kind of there's like toxic compassion or like toxic empathy, and I tend to sort of eschew the toxic language because I don't find it that helpful, but it's a useful concept where it's this socialized and conditioned compassion and empathy that is designed to be our own undoing, where it becomes self-sacrificial. And so like, no, we can't do that. And also, it's not a coincidence that so much of our compassion and our care and our energies of that kind are like nicely channeled right back towards men, right? Or the social issues that men consider to be important, and never to ourselves as women or to other women. And so that really needs to be indicted. And like, we need to resist that. At the same time, we don't want to become so resistant to that we let it become another way to desensitize. But women's compassion is definitely exploited.
Yeah. But you write that radical empathy's edict is to end male dominion. And that's a key for me, because in order for us to become empathetic the way we were created to be, male dominion has to end.
Yeah. I mean, and that's just, that end game is what makes empathy, as I'm describing it, radical, because it is political and it's about seeing that like there is no end to suffering if you maintain this system that just radiates suffering in tendrils and tentacles into everything. And so your ultimate approach to ending suffering, the ultimate compassionate act, is to fight male dominion, because male dominion is the source of all of this. And so sometimes in doing that, it won't look compassionate at all, right? Where people will say to women, particularly, like, if you take a hard stance against male power, male dominion, you're constantly maligned as being not especially nice and unkind in all of these ways, and harsh. But we have to hold to that, like, it is compassionate to end these systems. Our ultimate goal is the end of suffering, and there's nothing more compassionate than that. And we can't be tricked into these kinds of superficial compassionate acts that just let men off the hook again and again.
Well put, well said. I wanted to know if you could read a part which I found very, very beautiful about breathing on page 228.
Through this shared breath, our lives sluice one into the other. The air you took into your body with your last breath swift spun through the blood of a billion creatures before it reached you, traveling through miles of forests and oceans to fill numberless lungs, to fuel the beating of how many hearts until it found your nostrils flared before it slipped through your parted lips. Trees and phytoplankton suffused the air with oxygen as an offering to your species, and once you've nursed of this mouthful, with the generosity inborn to your organism, you will return the gift, the air as it leaves you, leavened now with the carbon dioxide your green collaborators feast upon.
That's so beautiful. It's just so beautiful. It's very, very moving, very moving. Such a moving book. It's a phenomenal sort of monumental work. I hope you know that.
Thank you. I mean, people have been, it's hard. People say things like that to me, and I'm like, no. But I hope it will prove valuable. It's sort of hard because sometimes when you do something that's quite foundational, it feels really simple or obvious. And I had that insecurity all the time as I was writing this. I was like, oh, I'm just writing about the most basic thing possible. But at the same time, that foundational stuff, it slips away. It becomes invisible. And so even if it is simplistic or redundant in some way, I do think there's merit in like bringing it back whenever we can. So thank you.
Yeah, and I also think that we as women, as a sex class, are so, for lack of a better word, brainwashed, inundated, filled with these belief systems that you do have to take it back to basics in order for everyone to kind of to be able to take it on board, like break it down into its kind of elemental pieces in order to get it all.
Take a breath and reset.
Yeah.
Let's look at what's going on here, because it gets very complex and it's easy to get lost in the weeds. But it's also very easy in feminism for things to become kind of one issue, right? And you select, say you take prostitution and that's your issue, or you take transgenderism and that's your issue. And you can sort of broadly say that these are connected because they have to do with women in some way, but it's much deeper than that. And it is really useful to have kind of a holistic analysis of all of these things and where they keep coming up from, because there's always going to be something new, right? Until we deal with the groundwork, with the bedrock, there's going to be new forms.
Absolutely.
And we need to be as integrated in our approach as we can be.
Yeah, I absolutely see that. Thank you so much for talking to me. It was such a pleasure, this conversation.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you.
Okay, bye. Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheesley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.